He used to be called Citizen 625726. He used to call himself Unbroken. When he left his dystopian city behind, he thought he had found paradise. What he found was uglier and darker than anything he could have imagined. This is his story. This is Inferior. Now available at Amazon, Smashwords, and at studiobrainstorm.net. Links in the description. In keeping with the theme of things going from bad to worse, Nights of Anger continues where Days of Fear left off, in ramping up the stakes and throwing ever more deadly obstacles in the path of our heroes. Here, Brian Ching did the art for the first of the 3 issues comprising Nights of Anger, while the other 2 were done by Harvey Tollebaugh, the guy who did the second half of Reunion. The covers were all done by Colin Wilson, a New Zealand artist who did cover art for both Knights of the Old Republic and Rebellion, as well as interiors for Rebellion, Legacy, and Invasion, a storyline set during the Yuzhan Vong War. Apparently, this style of cover art, which is basically like a giant panel complete with dialogue, is a nod to Joe Kubert, an artist who used this formula for war comics during WW2. Personally, I'm not a fan of this particular style, but I can appreciate a good tribute when I see one. At any rate, Nights of Anger really starts off with a bang. It begins with Rana Te, one of the 4 Jedi Seers of the Covenant, having a nightmare that's essentially a twisted inversion of the Padawan massacre. As a child, Rana Te flees into the Jedi Temple on Taris in the midst of a Mandalorian invasion, only to find 4 dead figures in red Enviro suits and 5 Padawans, led by Zane Carrick, standing over their bodies. Zane even repeats the same words that Lucian said to him when he stumbled in on the real Padawan massacre. And my god, just some of the lines that Miller writes here. This is the temple on Taris. We abandoned it. We never left it. This isn't your vision. This is mine. Remember my vision? The one who confesses lives. You see? You can remember your teachings. God, again, why wasn't Miller the one writing the dialogue for the prequels? Anyway, just as the Padawans are about to force Rana Te to look at the faces of the dead bodies, she awakens from her nightmare aboard a starship. To quote a comment left on a comic reading site by a guy known only as Dylan, the parallels in that vision, sweet cinnamon toast fuck. This is how you write a Star Wars story. While I could do without the profanity, I heartily endorse the sentiment. Yeesh, with nightmares like this, it's no wonder Rana Te hasn't been getting sleep as far back as Reunion. Still, sleep deprivation or no, Rana Te, like the other members of the First Watch Circle, is convinced that there's only one way to end all of this. Kill Zane Carrick and his allies. Speaking of which, it's long past time that we finally started getting some answers about Camper and Jarael's past. Or at least Camper's past anyway. Jarael's backstory will have to wait for another time. The old man's condition is becoming increasingly grim, and despite Roland Dyer displaying an unusual amount of medical knowledge for a Mandalorian soldier, the Last Resort just doesn't have the facilities required to help Camper. Jarael is surprised that a Mandalorian warrior would be so good at medicine, and Roland reveals that he was originally studying to be a doctor before he joined the war. I especially love the line of, there are 2 kinds of Mandalorian warriors, the ones who figure out how to use their medkits and the ones we bury. All that aside, the Mandalorian recommends that what Camper needs most is a doctor who's familiar with treating Arcanians. As luck would have it, the Last Resort happens to be close to Arcania, and Roland mentions the name of a powerful medical conglomerate called Adas Corp. Unfortunately, according to Jarael, Adas Corp are the very people that Camper's been hiding from all this time. And given that she's sworn to protect him, handing him over to the very people he's been trying to avoid all this time isn't exactly something that a protector ought to do. Still, Camper needs treatment soon, and Jarael's options are pretty limited. Then, thinking about what Zane, or better yet what Griff would have done in her place, she comes up with an idea of sorts. After taking a blood sample from Camper, Jarael hails a passing space liner to get her to Arcania, leaving the old man and the last resort under Roland's watchful eye. And so, Jarael, who has never seen Arcania before, sets foot on the birth world of her people for the first time. Specifically, the frigid mountain-bound city of Adaskopolis, the ancient capital of Arcania, as well as the seat of the House of Adaska, the family that owns and runs Adascorp. The other noteworthy detail, as Jarael discovers when she tries to go to the med center, is that Adaskopolis has a segregationist policy. This bit of lore was the result of the fact that when Brian Ching did the original concepts for Jarael and Camper, Miller liked them, but noticed that they were very different from that of other Arcanians like, say, Master Arca Jeth from Tales of the Jedi. Master Arca has golden skin, white hair and eyes, and 4 clawed fingers on each hand. In contrast, Jarael and Camper both have very pale white skin, normal human-looking eyes, and 5 fingers on each hand without the claws. Uniquely, Jarael has pointed elf-like ears, but that's a detail to be explained much later. In fact, Jarael admits that even she doesn't know why they're like that. It was this, combined with Miller's experience of protests against those who did business with apartheid South Africa, that gave him the idea for the Arcanian offshoots. Arcanians are a people who are both very arrogant and very, very skilled in genetic engineering. In fact, there's a quote about them that's supposedly attributed to Master Arca Jeth, that the only thing more dangerous than a foolish Arcanian is a smart one. Basically, they're a culture for whom the moral of Jurassic Park would have gone right over their heads. When rich veins of precious gemstones were discovered near places like Adaskopolis, the Arcanians, in their hubris, decided to genetically modify members of their own species to make them more proficient at mining. Arcanian geneticists combined their own DNA with that of other humanoid species, and thus the Arcanian offshoots came to be. Endowed with superior physical strength and dexterity, but at the price of an immune system so weak it's only slightly better than that of the Quarians from Mass Effect. The baseline Arcanians, calling themselves purebloods, looked down upon the offshoots as an inferior race fit only for the kind of menial labor they were literally genetically designed for. Once the mines ran dry, the offshoots were effectively left to fend for themselves, reduced to second-class citizens on their own planet, converting their former mining camps into small communities and villages. Jarael learns this first from being barred entry to the medical facility of Adaskopolis on account of her race, and then when another offshoot named Zadawi takes pity on her and brings her to her family, where she gets a hot meal and essentially learns the situation that the offshoots have to put up with. It turns out things have only gotten worse for the offshoots as time passes by. Back when Zadawi's grandmother was young, an offshoot could even aspire to higher education, but nowadays that sort of thing is impossible. Perhaps the greatest injustice, though, is the fact that despite that Arcania boasts Adascorp, one of the greatest medical companies in the world, none of that medical knowledge has either been used to give medicine to the offshoots or boosting their immune systems, which would give them a better chance against disease. The older generations of the offshoot community seem to passively accept their fate and hold out a forlorn-sounding hope that the new Lord Adaska, Lord Arco, might actually turn things around for them, as he reminds them very much of his great-grandfather, who was apparently quite kind to the offshoots in his day. Meanwhile, the younger generations, like Zadawi, aren't so willing to give the purebloods the benefit of the doubt. When she learns why Jarael came to Arcania, Zadawi decides to help her, if only to get one over on the purebloods. So, the next day, a very well-disguised Jarael enters the med center and submits Camper's blood sample and biomed readings. The desk clerk is obviously surprised that a fellow pureblood would want treatment for an offshoot, but a generous bribe by Jarael seems to convince him to turn a blind eye to such a scandalous request. Emphasis on the seems part. The clerk submits the data, and then contacts security and his superiors. We then cut back to the last resort as Camper finally regains consciousness, only to find that he and Roland are being hailed by the Arcanian Legacy, a massive starship that doubles as a space-borne medical research facility. Camper is of course horrified that the company has finally caught up with him, and is shocked to learn that he's being contacted by Jarael herself in the company of Arco, the 9th Lord of Adaska and the current head of Adascorp, who seems willing to help. Again, seems. Camper immediately goes into shock and is rushed aboard the Arcanian Legacy for emergency medical treatment. There is a brief altercation with Roland, but eventually Adaska is able to persuade the Mandalorian to come peacefully. While Jarael frets over the state of Camper's health, Adaska takes her on a tour of the Arcanian Legacy and provides both her and the readers some long-awaited answers as to the nature of Camper's past. Camper had been a scientist working for Adascorp back when Adaska's grandfather had run the business. One of the last offshoots to graduate from university before higher education was closed off to offshoots, Camper was something of a wunderkind, a genius prodigy in both the mechanical and biological sciences. However, Adaska admits that during his grandfather's time, the company performed some pretty nasty abuses, and it was this that caused Camper to leave, though he doesn't elaborate as to exactly what those abuses were. Adaska reveals that thanks to the blood sample that Jarael submitted back at the med center on Adescopolis, it's clear that Camper is suffering from something called Balanquar's virus, a particularly nasty neurodegenerative disease that manifests in elderly males. Lord Adaska assures Jarael that he will do everything in his power to see Camper restored to full health. It's the least he can do, even if he can't make full amends for all the wrongs Camper has suffered in the past. It's a plausible sounding narrative, and given that Jarael's attention is mostly focused on Camper's well-being, it makes sense that she doesn't question it too much. But at this point, any reader with a half-functioning brainstem can see where this is going. A rich corporate elitist type with a silver tongue and an ulterior motive? We've all seen this archetype before. The reader's suspicions are confirmed a little bit later when Adaska visits Roland in his holding cell. From this exchange, we learn two things. One, that Roland the Questioner, who supposedly died heroically at Flashpoint, has become something of a legend among the Mandalorians. And two, that Roland isn't fooled for a minute, either by Adaska's bland assurances of his good intentions or by this talk of Balanquar's virus, a virus that doesn't exist. Adaska grudgingly admits that he needs both Jarael and the Mandalorian for a special project, though he doesn't reveal any details as of yet. He does, however, allow Roland free reign of the main decks of the Arcanian Legacy so long as he has an escort with him. As for Camper, while Jarael is told that he is still recovering from his illness, it seems that the old man is already completely cured. Rather than some made-up virus, he was suffering from a severe allergic reaction. Remember that the last resort had been buried in a junkyard on Terrace. Who knows what kind of nonsense was growing inside the ship's systems, including the air circulation system. Whatever it was something that Camper was allergic to. The deterioration of his mental and physical health was a direct result of him taking the last resort into space and turning on the air filtration system, causing whatever allergen was there to spread throughout the ship. We also learn that before he ran away from Adascorp, Camper had been working on some important project for the company. And now that the old man's mind and body are fully functional again, Adaska's cyborg aide Iji makes him an offer he can't refuse. Finish the project, and no harm will come to Jarael. Meanwhile, back at the Battle of Sirocco, things continue to go downhill for the Republic, as the Mandalorians have cut the fleet to pieces and have boarded the flagship, the Courageous. As the ship's systems start failing all around him, Admiral Karath abandons the bridge, along with a few soldiers, Morvis and Cartho Nassi. Harried by Mandalorian shock troopers, the Republic Navymen are forced to barricade themselves in the detention block, tantalizingly close to the hangar where Onassi's deadweight sits, but with solid walls between them and freedom. Luckily for them, Zane is still in his cell, and he's willing to help them escape, but only on condition that they take him with them. Once he manages to extract from the Admiral a promise to that effect, Zane reveals that during the hours of the battle, he's been using the Force to unscrew the bolts from one of the wall plates at the back of his cell, granting everyone easy access to the hangar. As Onasi flies the deadweight away from the Republic's latest defeat, they receive a cryptic message from Arco Adaska by way of EG. The cyborg keeps his message vague, but insists that the Admiral attend upon his employer, as Arco Adaska might have a way to allow the Republic to actually win the war. The news of the Republic defeat at Sirocco spreads quickly. Once the news reaches the banking planet of Telarath, everyone panics with the exception of Lucian Dre. Apparently, he had arranged to meet with Admiral Kareth here to take custody of his former Padawan. With that plan out the airlock, Lucian arranges a private communication with Hazen back on Coruscant. The main takeaways from this conversation are as follows. 1. The Dre Trust, mentioned back in Reunion, is apparently the main source of finances for the Covenant and its activities, and that there are watch circles within said Covenant dedicated solely to keeping track of the markets, making sure that the Trust is always full of money. 2. Another of the watch circles has recently had a vision suggesting that Arco Adaska will soon come into possession of a dark, ravenously hungry, and terrible power. Apparently, through more mundane means, Hazen has learned that the Lord of Adaska has been reaching out to several people, including the leaders of the Revankist faction within the Jedi Order. Since Lucian happens to be in the area, and in the aftermath of the Battle of Sirocco, Hazen assumes that Zane is either dead or a Mandalorian prisoner, he charges Lucian with investigating exactly what Adaska is up to. As to that, Adaska is up to his usual tricks, playing the gracious host for Jerael while simultaneously strong-arming Camper into completing that mysterious project he ran away from all those years ago. However, it would seem that the Lord of Adaska's interest in Jerael is not purely a matter of facade, as he provides EG with a blood sample of hers to examine. He also manages to come to something of a rapprochement with Roland. He reveals to the Mandalorian, though not to the reader, his plan, and then makes a deal. If Roland will contact someone for him, not named, he'll not only let the Mandalorian go, but he will also allow him to take Jerael and Camper with him, as he figures by then the two offshoots will no longer be of any use to him. But at long last, over a seemingly polite dinner meeting with Jerael, Arco Adaska finally unveils his plan. But before he gets there, Adaska brings up to Jerael something that I find particularly fascinating. It's pretty clear that, like most purebloods, Arco Adaska has a pretty low opinion of the offshoots. That said, he does possess enough self-awareness to acknowledge that his people have gone too far in their pursuit of science, and that tampering with their own genetics to create the offshoots in the first place was either ethically dubious at best and outright immoral at worst. He considers it a wrong that must be righted, and, given that he has the most advanced genetic science at his fingertips, he suggests to Jerael the possibility of making it so that offshoots will give birth to pure-blood Arcanian children and only pure-blood children. This is a very fascinating idea, and I wish that Miller had been able to go into more detail, but that would be a tangent away from the main focus of the story, so I understand why he doesn't explore it any further than this brief conversation. And frankly, at the time of this recording, I wouldn't trust any of the writers at Disney Marvel to handle such subject matter with anything resembling intelligence or grace. Still, this is a really fascinating idea, especially given the fact that the Arcanian offshoots are the direct result of genetic meddling, and have suffered a lot for that, both in terms of the racism they have to put up with from the purebloods, and the fact that because of the genetic meddling, their immune systems are so very vulnerable to disease. What was done to the offshoots has done them very little favors and has caused them many problems. Would Adaska's proposal, as he seems to think it, constitute the righting of a past wrong? Or would this proposal, the deliberate phasing out of a distinct genetic lineage, be nothing more than soft genocide, ethnic cleansing by other means? It's food for thought if nothing else. Maybe you guys can discuss it in the comments section. But at last, Arco Adaska's true objectives are finally revealed, and he's just egotistical enough to explain it in full. It begins with exogorths, better known as the not-so-humble space slug. Gigantic void-breathing organisms that mostly subsist off of rocks and minerals in the vacuum of space, but will happily consume anything that is unfortunate enough or stupid enough to fly down their cavernous throats. 30 years ago, Camper, known then as Gorman Van Drake, led a team of Adascorp scientists to conduct a study of one of these giant monsters. In the course of these studies, Gorman Van Drake learned many things, including the fact that space slugs go into a dormant hibernation state when there's nothing to eat and effectively ride the solar winds from one system to the next. Not content with merely understanding the space slugs, Van Drake, before he fled from Adascorp, was on the verge of developing the right kind of technology that could contact the rudimentary brains of the space slugs. Contact and control them. Right on cue, the Arcanian legacy arrives at its final destination, a dying star system known as Omanoth that is very, very rich in mineral-laden debris. Originally, Adascorp had intended to set up a mining operation in the system, only to find that the system was literally lousy with space slugs, and they proceeded to devour the mining equipment and droids along with the asteroids in system. However, there were so many of them that Omanoth's resources were very swiftly devoured, and so, their existence known only to the leaders of Adascorp, the space slugs have been in hibernation ever since. Dozens of titanic predators, or, as Adaska thinks, living weapons. This is the project that he has forced Camper to finally complete. Each of the slumbering space slugs has special hyperdrive implants embedded in their hides. And now, thanks to Camper, Adaska finally has the means to control the space slugs. He can send them wherever he wants, stimulate their growth to truly titanic proportions, and awaken them to feed whenever it suits him. They are, as Jarael realizes with sudden horror, a plague, and thanks to Camper, it now works for him. And on that ominous cliffhanger, Knights of Anger comes to an end. I still think Commencement was the best single arc in the story so far, but Knights of Anger is a very close second. Now, all there is left to do is find out if the climax will live up to expectation in Days of Hate. Until then.